Hello and welcome everyone to CASSI's seminar series. My name is Sharath Pillai. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at CASSI and one of the organizers of this seminar series along with Amrita Kurian and Tariq Tachel. I want to make two quick announcements before I go to the speaker of today. The first is CASSI is celebrating its 30th anniversary in 2 weeks' time. In order to celebrate the anniversary, we have organized a day-long symposium on October 13th. The symposium will take place on campus in person. So if you're in Philadelphia or in the nearby areas, please come and attend it. This is a public event. Anyone can attend it, and all the details about the symposium and the exciting lineup of speakers is on our website. The second is the usual Thursday seminar will resume on October 20th. So the next Thursday seminar will be on October 20th. Where we will have Smita Radhakrishnan from Wellesley College speaking to us about gender and finance. That will be a fully online event as well. So today, we are extremely delighted to be able to host Aditya Balasubramanian. He's a lecturer in economic history at Australian National University. He's currently a fellow at the Center for History and Economics at Harvard University. Aditya is not new to Harvard. He received his undergraduate degree there, and then he went on to do his MPhil and PhD in Cambridge University as a Marshall Scholar. He is the author of the forthcoming book, Towards a Free Economy, Swatantra and Opposition Politics in Democratic India. This is forthcoming with Princeton University Press in just a few months. The book already has a website, so if you are interested, please check it out. He's the author of many articles. And especially noteworthy is this article on economic conservatism and democracy and license Raj that came out with Past and Present in 2021. Today, he's going to be speaking to us about the CBI and corruption in India. And the title of his talk is Anti-Corruption and the CBI, A History of Development and Incomplete Decolonization. So most of you are familiar with the format. Aditya will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, after which there will be Q&A. If you want to ask questions, please type in a personal message to me, Sharath Pillai, and I will call on you to ask your question. You can come online and ask the question. And the talk is being recorded, so please stay muted with no interruptions unless you're speaking or asking a question. Thank you. Over to you, Aditya.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really a delight to be able to be here and particularly present in this sort of 30th anniversary seminar, seminar series. Let me, there we go. See how this works. 1 second. Yeah, so you know, it's I guess I was saying before we started that the work of people attached to CASSI over the last 30 years has been very important to me. Chief among them, your founding director, Francine Frankel, and it's been in many ways so foundational for my work and the work of others. So yeah, absolutely sort of thrilled. So with that, I'll kind of get started because we don't have too much time. So in 2013, the Guwahati High Court in the Indian state of Assam declared the existence of the country's apex investigating body, the CBI, to be unconstitutional. 50 years previously, right, in 1963, this agency had been brought into being by resolution of the Home Ministry as the Central Bureau of Investigation and as a police force dedicated to anti-corruption. Its powers quickly widened beyond anti-corruption to cover crimes like murders, kidnapping, and terrorism. Crucially, for categories of crime that did not merely implicate public servants included within the body's purview, the state was given license to investigate private citizens from 1965 onwards. The 2013 court judgment asserted that because the resolution creating the CBI had been passed only by the Home Ministry and not the cabinet, and done so without the assent of the president, its creation had been illegal. And even though there was a constitutional provision for a Central Bureau of Intelligence and Investigation at the Constituent Assembly, the definition of investigation discussed was general inquiry. That was distinct from criminal investigation, which only police have the power to conduct. And police, under the 7th schedule of the Indian Constitution, is a state rather than a union subject, meaning that states raise such forces and their consent is required to have an investigation within their borders. Although the CBI is commonly understood to derive its powers from the Delhi Special Police Establishment Act of 1946, the resolution creating the CBI never referred to this antecedent. More problematically, the only police force that the Delhi SPE could raise under the 1946 Act would be for a union territory, not for the central government. After the judgment, the case was sent for a hearing by the Supreme Court of India. For about a decade, the court has stayed the case and it remains to be heard. Meanwhile, the fate of over 9,000 investigations and 1,000 trials hangs in the balance. Especially since the 1970s, governments in power have used the CBI to go after their enemies. P. Chidambaram, who arrested Amit Shah, and Amit Shah, who had P. Chidambaram arrested, are the two latest in this game. The retired Supreme Court Justice R.M. Lodha in 2013 called the CBI, quote, a caged parrot speaking in its master's voice, unquote. Since 2018, 9 non-BJP states have declined to give their consent to CBI to probe for crimes allegedly committed in their territory. More recently, kowtowing to the executive, the Supreme Court has expressed concern over these withdrawals of consent. In this talk, I want to address 2 questions. 1, how does one account for the persistence of corruption discourse, the evolution of anti-corruption institutions, and the bizarre phenomenon that the investigative body for anti-corruption against state officials has been turned against the people of India today? Taking a step back, I want to ask, how does governmental rationality or governmentality evolve in a post-colonial society where you have the dual inheritance of colonial institutions and anti-colonial nationalist leaders as masters of those institutions, often with emancipatory aims or politics? In India, this is further complicated by the fact that the state begins to reckon with democratic demands under the conditions of universal enfranchisement and accountability to their citizenry, and assumes increasing and increasingly vague responsibility for the phenomenon of development. Through this history of development as embodied in an institution like the CBI and its antecedents, I seek to link the new history of decolonization in South Asia, and I'm thinking of the work of Kalyani Ramnath, Rotem Geva, Radha Kumar, Ornit Shani, Rohit Dey, and the history of development, and thinking of Nikhil Menon, Ben Siegel, David Engerman, Matthew Schutzer, to the social scientific work on corruption and accountability done by scholars like Pranab Bardhan, Akhil Gupta, Nayanika Mathur, William Gould. My focus is the relatively underexplored topic of anti-corruption. What do I mean by embodied? I mean an embodied history that concerns an institution. The focus here is so that we get to everyday practices and consequences of development rather than merely the discourses of development or overarching development strategy that has tended to be the focus of these literatures. To address these questions, we have to go back to the transformation of the relationship between state and economy in World War II. The 3 parts of this paper move chronologically and hinge on major periods of change in anti-corruption. The first is World War II, right? The second spans post-war demobilization to the early 1950s inauguration of 5-year planning. And the third is during the 1960s, during the sort of crisis of planning. And each of these is a stage in the evolution of a more complex governmentality. The special police establishment and the issue of anti-corruption in the central government service is a thread that runs throughout. I examine how discourses of corruption evolve with examples from popular discourse at every stage to suggest that these institutional dynamics are connected to society at large. Guided by Akhil Gupta's point, the discourses of corruption are constitutive of the understanding of the state. So, stage 1. World War II wrought an economic transformation of the subcontinent. It launched a period of lopsided partial industrialization, led to the exhaustion of the railways, major deforestation, and the recruitment of over 2 million troops, something that is demonstrated in many-time Cassie visitor Srinath Raghavan's book, India's War. India became the arsenal for the British war in Asia, contributing supplies and manpower across Central, South, and Southeast Asia. For the first time, especially after the Japanese took Burma, the government of India actively assumed control and management over the food supply and instituted control prices. However, this came in the aftermath of, or at least, well into while the Bengal famine was unfolding. It was a case of too little, too late. Fortunately, just a second, the air in this room is a bit loud, so I apologize in advance for that, but I'll try to speak over it and hopefully it's not too distracting. So the movement of manpower and supplies during the war also required the quick construction and repair of roads and rail lines, barracks, and storehouses. To manage these processes, the government of India created various new departments, recruited new personnel, and passed emergency wartime laws under the Defense of India rules. In the interest of time, I'll leave out the sort of quantitative details and I won't bore you with the charts. But structurally, this created new instances of what economists like to call the principal agent problem, a conflict between one entity like the state and the representative authorized to act on its behalf. Social scientists have expanded this framework to consider the person on the receiving end of the activity as well. And so for my purposes, I want to use a slightly reworked framework of the social scientist Diego Gambetta, a tripartite relationship between trusters, fiduciaries, and recipients, in which the trusters are the government of India, the fiduciaries, the bureaucrats, and the Indian people are the recipients, as you see on the slide. The government endorses the bureaucrat to distribute a resource, issue a contract, or manage some process with broader purpose. The Indian person can be anybody from a recipient of food at a controlled price to a contractor building a makeshift shelter. Economic theorists have shown that ceteris paribus, conditions of scarcity and inequality can increase incentive for the abuse of office by raising the rent-seeking potential of the bureaucrat. I'm thinking especially of the essay by Abhijit Banerjee in 1997 called The Theory of Misgovernance. This was certainly the case in India and more so in the war. Over the course of the war, the number of these truster-fiduciary recipient relationships multiplied. Given the UK's kind of battered financial position and Japan's steady progress into maritime and mainland Southeast Asia, scrutiny turned to the supply base of British India. Apart from the bribery of officials, the issue of fake contracts and weaseling away of resources for sale on the black market became a serious concern. So, to combat this bribery and foul play associated with the vast increase in government activity during war, and to bring government officials to trial, the government of India created a special police staff in 1941. Under powers of emergency wartime legislation, it was placed under the exclusive authority of the Governor General and empowered to act swiftly. As the war proceeded, the staff was legally reconstituted, expanded, and given greater powers. In 1943, an ordinance formally constituted this body as a special police establishment of the War Department. That legislation created a special tribunal for prosecuting crime related to stores, supplies, or work connected with the war, and widened the body's powers to include investigating railways-related corruption. Most of the cases the SPE investigated focused on activity that curbed the strength of military operations or indirectly increased wartime expenditures. By far the most common offense was contractors supplying inferior quality materials to the military and paying off military officers to look the other way. Mainly isolated incidents, the odd case might unearth large rings of corrupt contractors to be blacklisted from army supply jobs in the future. Contractors also paid bureaucrats to fudge accounts and show deliveries at a higher price than was actually paid, and then split the difference. For their part, wayward officials might sell military goods to civilians via the black market. Once these got into the hands of traders, they could be hoarded and allow prices to further rise. The federal provisions of the 1935 Government of India Act created challenges for the SPE because the act devolved powers like those over the police forces to the provinces. This created complications for recruitment to an all India organization like the SPE. Provincial forces, themselves constrained by an inadequate number of qualified officials, had little incentive to part with their staff. In fact, the SPE managed to secure less than half of the officers requested on secondment from the provincial police forces. However, once trial proceedings did commence, conviction outcomes were satisfactory. The documentary record points to a concentration of cases in Northwest India, where crucial transport routes lay for supplies to efforts in the Middle East, and there was constant insecurity due to tribal unrest. Mostly, officers were charged under the Indian Penal Code of 1860 or the Wartime Defense of India rules. Conviction typically led to imprisonment or fines. Insofar as the Indian public was concerned, the corruption of these officials was not a serious concern. Rather, the major popular issue was hoarding, which was one of the contributors to the Bengal famine. Indeed, this was one of the major themes of the 1946 realist film Dharti Ke Lal, Children of the Earth, of which you see a flyer in the slide, right, and was brought out by the Indian People's Theatre Association. It captures how the protagonist farmer family sells their grain to a hoarder to finance a family wedding. Once scarcity hits, the farmer has to repurchase the grain at a much higher price, and soon faces destitution. To seek better fortunes, the protagonist moves to the city of Calcutta. There, he finds that hoarded grain enters the homes of the rich, while destitute migrants from villages starve on the streets. However, the colonial state was not necessarily interested in that problem. Another sort of piece of trivia is that Dharti Ke Lal is Zora Sehgal's first movie. So for the film buffs out there. To take a step back, what can we say about this period? Well, read as part of India's development history, this is a period of a significant shift where the state assumed new powers in economic life. In various domains, the government of India demarcated the legal and created its other, the illegal, whether that was the illegal black market price, the illicit possession of foreign exchange, the fudge contract, or whatever. The expansion of the state and its activities created new truster fiduciary recipient relationships and choke points for activity understood to be corrupt. Anti-corruption was a concern insofar as it connected to the war efforts. Indians' welfare was not important, and it mattered only when it overlapped with those war objectives. Institutionally, the state created an influential apparatus that sought to eliminate bribery and corruption. This is, in a sense, the most elementary form of governmentality, and I'm using it in the same way as in Foucault's treatment in articulated in Security, Terror, and Population, and in The Birth of Biopolitics, right? So the state identifies a problem and then it seeks to eliminate it. That's the most sort of crude form. The greater complexity, as we shall see, arises later. And it's the war that sets the template for what happens in part 2, right? Okay, so now we get to transitions. Right? So on 15th of August, 1947, as I'm sure all of you are aware, India became formally independent from Britain. Nevertheless, in the interest of managing political dissent and various separatist pressures, the interim government of India and Dominion government, so 46 to 7 and 47 to 50, refrained from loosening the grips of wartime power as it contended with the partition, the integration of princely states, various separatist revolts, and other challenges. So well into the 1950s, two crucial features of wartime political economy persisted. First, the size of the state's personnel continued to expand to govern economic activity. New departments of the government and positions of employment sprung up, creating additional layers of the bureaucracy. Second, to manage scarcities, the government of India retained specific laws controlling economic resources. So new fiduciaries with more powers were inserted between trusters and recipients who were transitioning crucially from subjects into citizens. Government assumed responsibility not merely for controlling the pattern of production, but also bringing the poor along and ensuring a modicum of equality and distribution, or a modicum of equity and distribution. And because Nehru was hemmed in by a largely conservative balance of power in the Congress Party organization, which blocked progressive developmental legislation, the sort of long and sad story of land reform, he relied increasingly on the bureaucracy to perform developmental roles, often by executive fiat. And this is what Professor Kaviraj has called the logic of bureaucracy, right, which takes its antecedents in the colonial period. Pursuing economic plannings towards these objectives required recasting policies like rationing and price control of commodities as part of redistributive justice. Quotas on exports and imports, capital issues, regulation of foreign exchange, and high levels of taxation channelized resources for the first 5-year plan to stabilize the Indian economy after war and the partition of British India into India and Pakistan. As Rohit Dey has shown, post-colonial economic laws cast India's underdevelopment as a permanent economic emergency. So you have the retention of emergency powers as you move from wartime emergency to dominion emergency and development as emergency. The government of India continues to control, prices of essential commodities, right? And as part of this welfare imperative, it regulates the production, distribution, sale, and storage of these commodities. However, the emphasis is on the provision of goods by the state rather than citizens' rights to these goods. And so mirroring colonial privileges of the administrator, the post-colonial economic bureaucrat was given the arbitrary power to grant and revoke licenses and to impose and exempt licenses from certain conditions. The state invents the category of the socioeconomic offense, and bureaucrats go after traitors mercilessly as possible criminals. Courts generally delivered guilty verdicts when these matters went to trial. So what kind of bureaucratic practices that you see connoting some kind of abuse of office? Well, you continue to see bureaucrats evolve in activities commenced during World War II, hoarding, dealings on the black market, tax evasion, food adulteration, illegal trading in licenses and permits. These take on new life in the post-colony. Railways are a site of corrupt activity that are particularly prominent, especially when there is more civilian travel that resumes in this period. The upgrade of infrastructure after wartime devastation, movement of traffic and freight schedules, contracts for siting in new tracks. And so in popular discourse and in government inquiry reports, we hear accounts of railway bureaucrats harassing customers and over-invoicing them. One such was the short story Upar Ki Kamai by the travel writer and Buddhist scholar Bhadanta Anand Kausalyayan, in which the narrator's friend in a third-class compartment comes to see the author in a second-class compartment just before the train stops. The ticket checker asks a friend for extra fare because the ticket and the class do not match. Although the friend tries to explain that his belongings and seat are in the other compartment and that he has just come to look in on Kausalyayan, who is, it's the first person narrator who assumes that he's the author as well. So, the ticket checker will have none of this explanation. Upon arrival at the next station, the checker turns the friend over to the gate clerk, the friend ends up having to pay both the ticket checker and the gate clerk for his alleged infraction. In the second incident, the narrator decides to extend his ticket and get off at a further away station. To do so, he alights from the train temporarily at an immediate stop. However, the ticket clerks introduce delays and keep palming off his request to other clerks until he is almost out of time to get back on the train. He gives them the requested sum and then gets back on the train. And at that point, right as this train is pulling out of the station, one of the clerks gives him a receipt and the revised ticket. However, when he looks at it, the receipt is for much less than the amount that he has paid. Using these methods, station ticket clerks and inspectors make Upar Ki Kamai, or top-ups. What does this mean for the anti-corruption apparatus? So after the ordinance responsible for creating the SPE lapsed, right, the interim government passes the Delhi Special Police Establishment Act of 1946. Now, that act gives the government power to constitute a special police establishment in federal territories, administered directly by the Indian government, and it also transfers the SPE to the Home Ministry, where it kind of continues, its future incarnation continues to reside. 4 years after that act, the Republican Constitution gave the center, with consent of the relevant state government, power to extend the jurisdiction of the police from one state to another, so you can conduct interstate kind of investigations. Right? The government also expanded the personnel and categories of crime dealt with by the Anti-Corruption Unit. The Prevention of Corruption Act of 1947 supplemented the Indian Penal Code and defined a new category of called, quote, criminal misconduct in discharge of official duty. This included offenses relating to post-war reconstruction schemes, contract termination, and the disposal of government stores after the war. While the police remained a state subject in the 1935 Act, the SPE now had a much wider set of responsibilities. Crucially, 3 economic laws of wartime provenance that became pillars of the planned economy or planned economic life came under the SPE's purview. These were the commodity price controls, foreign exchange regulation, and import and export control. The SPE increasingly focused its energies on related violations and became busier and busier. By 1960, it had 16 branches, a central investigating agency, a new enforcement wing to deal with breaches of import and export regulations, and a fraud squad tasked primarily with handling violations of the new Company Act concerning joint stock companies. In 1963, the SPE investigated 8 times as many cases as it had in 1945. Apart from the expansion of activities, there was also the beginnings of a new performativity related to a kind of having to account to the Indian people as, enfranchised subjects. And you can see in my very bad Photoshop skills, I've put a dotted line reaching up from the recipients to the trusters to suggest there's some kind of influence pressure, but it's dotted, so it's like not that strong. So to this kind of this connoted so apart from doing more, the SPE also began to write monthly press releases. The director wrote monthly press releases and invited citizens to contribute leads about possibly wayward officials. And when these leads grew beyond what the SPE could handle, the Home Ministry created the Administrative Vigilance Division to sort through them and adjudicate which ones to investigate. That's the sort of forerunner of today's Central Vigilance Commission. The government of India began to do investigations into corruption to try to diagnose its nature, and it created and improved metrics of its case convictions by tweaking its administrative procedures, like, for example, making bribe payers immune from penalty, and therefore incentivizing them to report, and streamlining certain kinds of cases through summary trials. However, it continued to be dogged by a few issues. First, it had to recruit from state forces like before, and provincial officials didn't like moving to other parts of the country, especially because the SPE, time spent in the SPE didn't necessarily help with promotions or building one's reputation locally. Second, it was risky for business people to speak up because of the high protection of officials and compromised future access to licenses and challenges in dealing with the state when trying to do business. And finally, scarce staff, as before, meant inefficiency in dealing with complaints and an ever-increasing roster of matters to handle. So to take a step back again, in this second stage, anti-corruption, the discourse and practice of corruption concerned the management of resources involving the planned economy and the emergence of a new class of public officials associated with this resource management. Corruption continued to be defined by the state specifically as bureaucratic and something to be eradicated. And there's no reason to think that in popular discourse this was seriously contested. But practical constraints to total eradication emerged. We see a kind of path dependence here insofar as there were wartime antecedents to what takes place. But as Rotam Geva has pointed out, in the context of civil liberties in the Dominion and early Republican era, these are conscious choices that are made to retain or perpetuate old laws and procedures. We need not see continuity as something that comes from ignorance. And we can also detect some change with respect to the state's self-conscious attempt to give an account for its anti-corruption activity and solicit citizen participation. Further, it tried to establish some metrics for its success. But as long as the political legitimacy of the ruling Indian National Congress Party and its strategy of bureaucratic centralization was never seriously questioned, this policy broadly worked. But things fall apart. So by the 1960s, right, the Indian economy began to lurch towards crisis. Right? I think there's a chapter in Francine Frankel's Indian Political Economy called Planning in Crisis. So here we are. Okay, so having stabilized the economy by the mid-1950s, India funded the second five-year plans, which is 1956 to 61, ambitious investment pattern to usher in heavy industry-led import substituting industrialization, ISI. That process required even tighter bureaucratic control of resources and left consumer goods sectors and agriculture behind. Second plan also relied on deficits that stoked inflation and was compounded by poor food harvests. During the third plan period, 1961 to 6, per capita income was flat and food inflation rose to over 30%. Government reports showed that income inequality over the previous 10 years had increased substantially. And by this time, factional infighting had also beset the Congress, which had, for the last 2 decades, dominated the country's electoral landscape. Developmental woes coincided with a discourse of corruption that created a kind of political pressure for changes in anti-corruption policy. In this third stage, the discourse of corruption widened to comment not merely on wayward individual bureaucrats or small groups of chums, but on abuses of power by elected politicians acting in conjunction with vested interests. So the feminist writer Krishna Sobti's novella, Yaron Ke Yaar, is a good example. Whereas Upar Ki Kamai had spoken specifically about a wayward ticket collector or a few of them, this short work uses the chit-chat of an office of the central government to paint a picture of a system corrupted from clerk to minister. People get ahead by contacts, nobody plays by the rules, everyone is in it for themselves, and advancement in the profession depends on patron-client relationships. Bureaucrats authorize licenses for business and are quite literally compensated with food and women. And nepotism in government is endemic. Sobti's novella appeared in the aftermath of well-publicized ministerial corruption exposés. So her critique and others can be seen as part of a broader trend of citizen response under the conditions of enfranchisement or the logic of democracy. The other dynamic that complements what Kaviraj called the logic of bureaucracy. Right? There sometimes it is intention, sometimes it perpetuates. Opposition parties seized upon cases like these to portray the Congress as corrupt and counter-democratic. The right-wing Swatantrata Party, which I've spent the last decade of my life studying, coined the memorable term permit and license Raj, an oligarchic coalition of bureaucrats, Congress politicians, and favored business people who receive permits and licenses required for commercial activity. The bureaucrats are in the pocket of Congress politicians. They get bribes from the business people, and the political parties in turn receive financial support from businesses. So the British Raj is over, but the new Raj of permit licenses threatens to hollow out the content of post-colonial democracy. So how did the Congress and the state respond? Right? So we have a few prongs, right? The first prong of the response is to launch investigations that are well publicized into ministerial conduct. The party also planned to have senior ministers resign to sort of stem the rot that had crept in after over a decade in power. This is the famous Kamaraj plan. And you see some elected leaders who are found to have been involved in family aggrandizement are pressured to leave office, like as pictured Pratap Singh Kairong of Punjab, has the dubious distinction of being the first chief minister who leaves for corruption, and Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad of Kashmir, who was said to have set up the BBC, or the Bakshi Brothers Corporation. Okay. Next, the Congress invoked Gandhian ideas of self-restraint and morality, and the idea of citizenship as duty to solicit popular participation in anti-corruption. This was a way of kind of signaling virtue. Towards this end, the Home Minister, Gandhian named Gulzari Lal Nanda, created a Samyukta Sadachar Samiti, or United Association for Morality, of volunteers from various social and religious organizations around the country. The organization imploded after opposition parties pointed out that the sitting Home Minister could not be in charge of it. And that was the end of that. But finally, and more lastingly, the Congress launched administrative reforms. This involved selectively implementing the voluminous set of recommendations generated by an Administrative Reforms Commission that sat for several years in the 1960s. Apart from creating new, more stringent laws, these measures included trying to streamline administrative processes so that they would prevent opportunities for abuse of office. So to go back to Foucault, right, governmentality evolves from being purely about punishment of crimes to also being about creating an environment in which you prevent. Okay. The key institutional legacies of this period were the creation of the Central Vigilance Commission and the reconstitution of the Special Police Establishment as the Central Bureau of Investigation by Home Ministry resolution. The two were intended to complement each other and ultimately be made independent statutory bodies. The CVC, or Vigilance Commission, is responsible for providing sanction for CBI investigations from complaints received and recommending prosecution to the Home Ministry after the investigations were concluded. It also supplied departments of the various ministries with vigilance officers and oversaw punitive processes for non-criminal misdemeanors. At its head sat a Central Vigilance Commissioner appointed for a fixed tenure and barred from subsequently holding public office. The CBI incorporated the Delhi, for its part, incorporated the Delhi Special Police Establishment and newly created economic offenses and food and drug offenses wings. It was awarded the sanction to investigate all public sector bodies. Later developments would expose the Congress's response to be, in some ways, more performative than substantive. One issue was the non-implementation of a number of salient measures recommended by the Administrative Reforms Commission. For example, the government of India never weakened public servant protections or created the promised Lokayukta or ombudsperson for the centers. Further, during this period, neither the CVC nor the CBI was made an independent statutory commission. So investigation of concerns proceeded only when an appointee of the executive branch responsible to the Home Minister pursued them. And since 1965, as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, the CBI has powers of investigation not merely over public servants, but in those matters for which it investigates crimes that also entangle the citizenry at large. Although the Central Vigilance Commission was finally made independent in 2003, the CBI remains part of the Home Ministry. So what can we say about this period? You see from our trusters fiduciary recipient handy-dandy chart, the line from recipients to trusters is going a little bit thicker. The recipients, the Indian citizens in the truster fiduciary recipient relationships, are now exerting a kind of political and electoral pressure upwards rather than the downward pressure applied by the executive. Now, how exactly that plays, I'm not particularly invested in, but basically I'm just pointing out that political parties are taking up these issues and pushing. The discourse of corruption broadens to critique the system at large, and the performative dimension of anti-corruption grows more powerful as a response, right? But perversely, it was done so in a way, in the case of the CBI, in a way that the anti-corruption apparatus is later kind of turned on its citizenry and then corrupted itself. Governmental rationality at this stage evolves in a manner that there seems to be a tacit understanding that the anti-corruption body can really try to keep corruption within adequate limits rather than eradicate it. So that's the kind of third stage in Foucauldian governmentality, right? We move from elimination to prevention to management of the activity within suitable limits. This was also a period when, from the 1967 elections, Congress failed to form governments in 9 states and opposition parties did quite well, paving the way for something that continues to this day, where anti-corruption begins to have a political valence that exists for non-Congress, often anti-incumbent politicians. Key recent examples being Arvind Kejriwal and Narendra Modi. Right. So, what do we make of all this? I want to make a few points in conclusion. The first is that adopting the status model created new truster fiduciary recipient relationships with more choke points for abuse of office, the template for which was World War II. Those wartime efforts created a kind of path dependence for what came later. An institutional continuity underpins anti-corruption efforts, but it responds to changing rationales of emergency, war as emergency, integrity of the nation during the interim government and dominion period as emergency, and then development as emergency. And finally, anti-corruption's evolution from eliminate by punish to prevent to keep within manageable limits, to take the sort of Foucauldian framework, takes place in a somewhat reflexive relationship to changing discourses of corruption, and as anti-corruption politics start to take on democratic contours. But my own treatment is slightly different from the classic kind of Foucauldian case because the different stages are kind of contemporaneous, right? In that you have eliminate, prevent, and keep within manageable limits kind of coexisting. In different ways. So to conclude, the politician J.B. Kripalani asserted in the Constituent Assembly that we must have a police state before having a welfare state. Such a state will be the surest foundation for a welfare state. As many scholars have shown, colonial India was not quite a police state. But as Rotem Geva notes, Somnath Lahiri, the sole communist delegate to the Constituent Assembly, the fundamental rights were framed from the eyes of a police constable, in his opinion. What I want to suggest is that the mechanism of it would be perhaps surprising that the mechanisms of police power would prove so resilient as to resist decades of pressure for their dismantling in the post-colony. Why have I called this incomplete decolonization? What was so colonial about this? Well, the state adopted a colonial attitude and template by asserting this power, using colonial-era emergency procedures over its citizens, and ultimately making them all possible criminals. This was codified into law in the colonial era, and it's not debated later on, despite its ability to be repressive of the citizenry and not adequately sensitive to their notional sovereignty. It speaks to the Janus-faced nature of the post-colonial state, which at once seeks to emancipate its citizens from the chains of the past, and at times tighten them to prosecute its will. And I'd submit that it continues to persist in this particular instance because political elites find it useful. That's all. So thank you. I think you're on mute.
Sarath, I think you're on mute.
Sarath, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to close the, thank you, Aditya. Do you want to close the presentation so that we can all go into the main screen?
Yeah.
Okay, Amrita, we will get into questions right away. Amrita?
Hi, Aditya. Thank you so much for this conversation. I work a little bit on this in contemporary India, and so you've brought a lot of things that I'm still trying to process. But fundamentally, my question to you is, and this might sound a little, again, psychological, right? A lot of the idea of accountability and transparency post 60s and 70s comes from IMF and World Bank, right? And the idea that, post-colonial nations are not transparent enough.
Sure.
They're not good enough to be a democracy.
Right.
A lot of what you're saying seems to suggest, and which has also been written a little bit about, right? At the moment of independence, India itself has its anxieties that it's a poor nation, is a nation of scarcity. Can you speak a little bit towards this idea of transparency that's currently in vogue? And the other question is, can you think of anti-corruption discourses that's prevalent at the turn of independence to the moment right now as a sort of a cry against the loss of hegemony, right? Of the ones who have traditional power, the ones who could sequester resources, but now have to depend on the welfare state.
Sure.
Not to undermine corruption as, perpetuating structural inequality, but
Sure.
That's the way mostly poor people get resources, right? Which is otherwise sequestered by people in power. Thank you so much for your talk.
So am I on mute? No, I'm not. Okay, no. So I think those are really, really important questions, and I think the challenge is, of course, trying to account for exactly what you say, which is, the sort of fetishizing of accountability, transparency, right? As Nayanaka Mathur shows in her work, it is precisely these transparency processes that are the ones that arrest, the policy from being executed, right? So I think, a kind of skepticism about that is important. But at the same time, I think it's a difficult, ultimately you are looking at just the discourses that are produced by the state about itself, and so that has to be read, with that kind of, kind of critical attitude. So what I've tried here is to kind of think about, at the time, sort of restore it to the historical context in which it's read. But I think that it would be a mistake to say that in the period that I'm looking at, that this is something that is purely driven especially from overseas interests. And I think in the 1960s, you do have this whole, all over the world, you have administrative reforms committees, you have the United Nations Decade of Development, and people in Malaysia are looking at India's corruption report and thinking about all of this sort of stuff happening. So I think that there are those global dynamics, but I think that they kind of fit well with, or they kind of intersect with dynamics that are taking place within India. And I think that you're absolutely right. The discourse of corruption, right, is often used by upper caste privileged elites. And even when we think of the Nehruvian era, they kind of look at the assertion of political power by people from other caste and class communities as certain kind of changing norms or whatever. No longer is polite English of the Queen spoken in the government office as symptomatic. And so I think that that's absolutely right. And anti-corruption is also a way in politics, this sort of period that I don't take up, I'm just kind of gesturing to, in which people who have got other kinds of political interests, right, are using it as a code word to bring together a much more sinister agenda, right? I think we all know what I'm kind of talking about, right? So I think that's absolutely the case. But I guess in trying to kind of historicize it, I want to think about rather than get into the whole corruption and what it is thing, and I mean there's a lot of great theoretical work on this, is to think about the sort of more limited problem as it's coming in here. But then again, as you say, but not to kind of keep it so disconnected that it looks like here's a history of the SPE from start to finish. So,
Shikhar?
Aditya, I had two questions for you.
yes.
Hi. One was, you trace a history that culminates in what I see to be two organizations. One is the CVC, the other is the CBI.
Sure.
Are there any differential implications for the CVC as compared to the CBI in the emergence of this kind of narrative? In the way it is set up or conceptualized, because these are different bodies and have come under different use. And so, one is the CVC, CBI comparison. The other is, I think you abstract away into a kind of colonial context. So has the experience of combating corruption through these kind of institutional tools been the same in some other colonies, even within the former colonies within the subcontinent, for example? And could you give us like a comparative sense of how the Indian experience sits with, say, that in Pakistan or Bangladesh? Thank you.
No, thank you. Those are both really excellent questions. I mean, I think the key point is that the CVC, as I see it, traces its origins to the Administrative Vigilance Division. I think it's so good to see it as kind of subservient and doing kind of some of the legwork for CBI, sort of one without teeth, and that one that kind of does I would say the first pass through the complaints and that sort of thing, and it's more about an organization for promoting good practice, whereas CBI is more right when crime has been committed, you go and you kind of pursue the investigation, right? So that's the kind of distinction. And as a result, if you were to look at articles about the CBI versus the Central Vigilance Commission, you'll see that one is much more prominent than the other, and that nobody considered a great victory for anybody that when the CVC kind of became independent. And and to kind of go back to Amrita's point, I think it's important to be sensitive to the fact that these are institutions that even if they have the most rigid setup, I'm conscious of this, the most rigid independent setup, they can very easily be kind of corrupted or whatever, misused. The second point is regarding the sort of post-colonial transitions. I mean, this is something that I'd like to develop much further, and part of it is sort of questions of access and whatnot, and that I'm not particularly well schooled in the comparative method. But what I can definitely tell you is that there's a lot that parallels Malaysia. and India. And this sort of wartime transformation under the Japanese that Chris Bailey and Tim Harper have written about. And actually in the 60s, Syed Hussein Alatas, who wrote The Myth of the Lazy Native, was a contemporary of Edward Said, etc., wrote a number of influential works on corruption where he kind of says that this all goes back to World War II, and you see a lot of things taking place that are quite paralleled, that very closely parallel what takes place in the Indian case, without, of course, the sort of final stage, democratization, the crisis of the state kind of thing, because there you have a slightly different political process. But they're also in that country interested in sort of administrative reforms in the 60s.
Tariq?
Aditi, thanks so much for that talk. Yeah, just thinking through the importance of kind of understanding this specific history. You had quoted a couple of times Kaviraj, and it was funny. Like there was an article of his in EPW that came out, I think in the late 80s, where he talked about the story of Indian politics can be told in two quite different ways. I think he says one is, I think, the story of structures, and then one would be actual political actors.
Sure.
And he says these are not at odds with each other, they can be mutually reinforcing. But the reason I was thinking about that is that I thought while there was a lot that I kind of gleaned from your presentation, I did find it kind of oddly unpeopled in some ways. And I do think that you said at the end that was, you're not particularly interested in like highlighting individual biographies. That said, I do wonder if like the overall effect of the argument or misses something by, I mean, there's a lot of kind of institutional path dependence here, which may be the general point you want to make about,
Sure,
especially in the wartime moment, but it's a little bit hard to fully square that without some sense of the political incentives at play, even within the bureau. Were there other when one bureaucracy is expanding its remit, potentially other bureaucracies are losing out on that. The story of a struggle of particular actors and alignments with people in political office. And because all of that bears very much on even on how we understand the CBI today, I think it'll also give the piece a kind of wider readership. I don't know what stage of development it is now to bring at least some of that. And so I was wondering if you could reflect if there were one or two either kind of political moments or actors that you would like to inject or you think is very central to this story. Yeah. Who would they be? Or what would those moments be? I mean, I'm kind of putting you on the spot. Maybe there's only one or two, but I do think it would kind of in some ways add a lot to the breadth of the analysis to have that folded in somewhere, even if it's not central.
Yeah. So I think that's really helpful advice. It is currently in the state of purgatory known as revise and resubmit, as I was telling.
Okay.
And one of the peer reviewer comments was that this reads a little too much like Inside Baseball. So we don't know our peer reviewers, but Inside Baseball was, I imagine they're somewhere in this country because people in Britain wouldn't talk about baseball, and certainly not in India. So I guess I would kind of talk a little bit about a couple of people. I mean, the first would be that very enthusiastic first director of the Special Police Establishment, Bambawale. And there's a case to be made that in those early years, he kind of puts it on a really firm footing because I think he's in charge of it for like 10 years, which is a fairly long period of time. And that's also an invitation, I think, to think about, trying to recover certain kinds of private papers, or at least trying to trace certain kinds of family networks, because you might kind of get some color to who are the kind of people involved in this space. And that also gives you a nice foil when you compare it to sort of Krishna Sobti's novella, where it's like a lot of, heavily swearing kind of people speaking in very particular kind of Hindi that would make someone blush, that sort of thing. And it kind of gives you, that sort of texture. And the other thing would be, I kind of dismissed it as kind of futile, but I think that the kinds of activities or kind of lengths through which Gulzari Nanda, Lal Nanda, and these people went through in this Samiti is quite interesting. Some of them, like, were businessmen who went around making a pledge saying, "I will not pay a bribe," and there's not audio evidence of this, but I think that it's great because that would kind of enliven, what I'm trying to present. So that's really helpful, and those points are well taken. And as I revise it, we'll definitely try to flesh that stuff out more. Yeah.
Well, I'll jump in and ask a question myself, and I have two quick questions, and both of them have to do with people. As Tariq kind of took us there. I was thinking about CBI as an institution in contemporary India, and most of the time, especially at local levels, CBI is seen as a less corrupt institution than a state government institution, right? For instance, when a sensitive crime happens in a state or something like that, there's a demand that, state government refer the case to the CBI because there's a public trust in that institution, which most of the time state institutions lack. So I was wondering, how does the public image of this institution as less corrupt would, fit into this, study that you're doing, or that might not be true. I mean, I don't know whether there's a public perception that makes this institution less corrupt, but at least, a state that I'm familiar with, which is Kerala, if you read the local news, there's always, someone demanding that a case be given to CBI because the state government is going to mess it up. And the second question is about, the transitional period, and you talked a lot about governmentality, and all of that is interesting. And you also talked about Kaviraj, and most of those post-colonial scholars who came in the wake of subaltern studies, who studied this transitional period, one of the important things they talked about is the problem of legitimacy, right? When you move from a colonial state, which lacked absolute legitimacy in the eyes of the people because it was not representative or democratic, and by the 50s, we have a democratic government, right? So people have written about whether, is it a good thing to have satyagraha against a democratic state, for instance, right? How people reacted to the state in the colonial times as opposed to the post-colonial times. So I wonder, when you talk about governmentality or this transitional time period, does the attitude of the people change in ways that are significant to the story? Thank you.
Yeah. So two things. Yeah, no, Shahid, absolutely. I mean, I think those are both really, really great questions. I think the first is that I would say that I think whether it's the CBI being less corrupt or whether the fact that it's escalation, we kind of have to think about, right? Is it, yes, theoretically the Supreme Court should be less corrupt than the High Court, but is it also the fact that, no, I'm going to get this is going to be, we have now gone from 5x to 10x. That's one question. But I think that there is definitely a lot that is done, right? Whether that is the way in which this publicity is handled in the early years, the fact that they produce these statistics of their conviction rates being high. There's all of that goes on, and it's an interesting thing to kind of take apart, that to produce this image of it is a body that actually works fairly well, right? Even though there's other evidence to the contrary that I've kind of discussed. So I think there's that. And the other thing is that I also haven't offered you any comparison because of the limitations of my inquiry to the sort of state level anti-corruption bodies. So I'm not so well placed to answer that. So on your question of governmentality, I mean, I think we're thinking about the article of your supervisor in the name of politics by Dipesh Chakrabarty in Public Culture. And I think, yeah, the attitude of the people changing is important, towards the state and what that is. And I think that that's one of the reasons why in my kind of early state, it was more about the hoarding trader. And your problem with the British is the fact that they're there, not the fact that, the colonial officer is, extracting money. Yes, it's a problem collaterally in that, they're colluding with the hoarders and whatnot. But you don't really care that, the British war effort is being compromised because some contractor is, or whatever, there's some contract that's not being obeyed or being allocated in an unpleasant way, sort of broadly. Whereas in the later stages, I think that at least in some circles, I'm not making an argument that everybody once enfranchised is now trying to hold the state accountable, but at least in some, so there's an idea that, look, we expect a little more here, right? And so there is that it has more legitimacy, but also more is kind of demanded of it. So, so there's that kind of dynamic as well.
So we are toward the end of the time, but we will take two questions together, and you can answer them together as well. Kim?
Sure.
Thanks so much, Eric. And thank you very much, Aditya, for this excellent talk. I was actually curious, since you used movies as examples and building off of Tariq's and Sarat's discussion of sort of peopling this a little more, as you looked at other materials that talked about how corruption was seen, or I guess thinking of movies, newspapers, and archival materials that you may have come across in developing this history, what are some of the affective or other ways people's responses to what corruption was, the thing of corruption itself, but also, I guess, in some ways, the response to it, like how did those change over time, if at all?
Lakiram, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Thanks, Aditya, for that. I just wanted, maybe by way of this question, greater clarity around this idea of development as emergency. So I'm just trying to understand, is it that you're trying to suggest that there was because in the way in which you seem to suggest, there seems to be a large scale consensus on development as a project of social transformation, right? And so is this a legal emergency without actually any social precarity? Because were one to look at the idea of emergency from, say, other critiques of the development national project, like, say, the Naxalbari, then this emergency takes on a very different perspective, right? And so I'm just trying to understand, what exactly do you mean by this idea of development as emergency, and who, like, emergency for whom? Emergency in the way in which the law kind of continues as a transformation in the colonial law, or emergency as a set of practices that lead to creation of certain kinds of populations? And that's for me where another kind of colonial legacy also continues, because it's interesting that you speak about Foucault's governmentality without actually speaking about its productive capacity to create docility and discipline. So, say, Tarangini Srinaman's work on petitions and identity documents in colonial India, especially documents how the very time of war, wartime rationing creates the petitioning legal subject. And it is the subject that then enters identity documents and legal documents. And we see precisely this kind of desire for docility as the continuation of corruption, right? And so I'm just wondering if you want to speak also in terms of peopling this, also in terms of its idea of what its public or its population looks like. Thanks for that.
Yeah, so those are both really excellent questions and comments. So thank you, both Kim and Vikram. So I guess, in terms of how does the discourse or the effect of corruption change, I think that at least and in the way that I'm seeing it, you start to see from the 50s, the 60s, the pivot is to one of kind of more outrage, right? And that's as something that then kind of flows through to more political pressure. With respect to Vikram's question about development as emergency, I'm kind of using it in the and again, admittedly, very kind of narrow way of thinking about the way in which sort of law that is devised for kind of temporary purposes under for something like war is then actually recodified as something else that is taking place in kind of everyday life, but is because it is seen to have a particular valence for something that is extremely important to continue, and therefore needs to be that much stronger, rather than the population control creation kind of imperative. But I think as I extend this paper, Right. So thank you, Amrita. But I think as I expand this paper, this is something that I have to, very useful to think about, particularly as you say, with reference to started question, which is, what kind of population is it trying to create, and thinking about the sort of life of the CBI, who then is the kind of person, I guess the criminal subject or whatever, the criminal citizen, who it is then kind of feeding into to generating. So that's really helpful, and something I'll kind of think about as I move forward.
Well, that brings to a close this seminar. I think we should all join and thank Aditya for giving this talk. And yeah.
Great.
Thank you so much, Aditya.
No, and thank you all of you for hosting me, and all of you for your wonderful questions.